Thank you for joining me. My name is Ollie, and here's your loaf of daily bread. Today's loaf comes to us from one of my favorites, Lucius Seneca the Younger, Stoic philosopher, Roman playwright, tutor to the Emperor Nero, and just an all-around interesting cat. And he said the following: "Just where death is expecting you is something we cannot know. So, for your part, expect death everywhere. Rehearse death." To say this is to tell a person to rehearse their freedom. A person who has learned how to die has unlearned how to be a slave. They are above, or at any rate beyond the reach of, all political powers. What are prisons, wardens, bars to that person? They have an open door. There is but one chain holding us in fetters, and that is our love of life. Death is a topic I haven't touched on a lot in these videos, and with good reason. It's kind of a turnoff. Death isn't really sexy. But in the few videos that I have talked about death, you will probably surmise that my view on it is quite different from most people's. My view on death is that death doesn't exist, quite honestly, and to make sense of that, I would suggest that our view of life is inaccurate, that what we call death is merely part of life, and we've simply labeled it differently and learned to regard it with fear. But we should be no more afraid of death than we are of living, because the two are one and there is no separation. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, "It is the fate of all living beings to die, and the fate of all dead beings to be born." And to me, that kind of summarizes it nicely. In order to be born, you had to be dead. You had to be non-existent. And in order to be born again, you're going to have to return to that state of non-existence. That's just the way it is. It's part of the process. So I'm not worried about death. And in fact, what I learned is that you can't have a functional philosophy of living, an approach to life that is holistic and functional, until you have a philosophy of death that is the same, holistic and functional. You have to learn how to move past your fear of death before you can live fully. And Seneca nails it here. He says, what can you possibly do to a person who's not afraid of dying? What's a jail cell or even the firing squad to a person like that? You can't force them to do anything. You can't manipulate them because you have no leverage over them. Because ultimately it all comes down to death. That's the ultimate leverage, and all fears stem from that original fear, the fear of our own mortality. The Garden of Eden story has more truth to it than we care to admit, friends. There is certainly a lot of psychological truth to that story. And one of those truths is the fact that before we ate from the fruit, we were totally unaware of death, unaware of our own mortality, to be more specific. The way animals view death, the way they don't think about it, is the state that humans were in before we developed this self-reflective consciousness, this capacity for self-awareness, conceptual self-awareness, because it's not just awareness of the body, it's awareness of the self, and that is very different, my friends. Humans became aware of their own impending death. We were able to project into the future and see that all living beings die, and then we realize, oh fuck, that means I'm gonna die. That's the original fear. That's the first and most powerful fear of all. And it's a fear that is totally unfounded and grounded in irrationality. If we regard death objectively, clinically, scientifically, there is absolutely nothing to be afraid of. If we regard it logically, we'll see that death is the only guarantee that comes with life. There are no guarantees in life except the fact that eventually your life will end. Life will continue, but your particular life will end. So if that's a guarantee from birth, you better get right with that, my friends. You better get your head around it, because it's a must. Everybody you know, everybody who's ever lived, everybody who ever will live, will pass away. It's not scary. It's natural. It's a necessity. It's life. It's the other half of the coin, guys. And until you learn it, and until you lose that primal fear of death, then you will be a slave. The person who has learned to die has unlearned how to be a slave. That's what Seneca says. There's very little that you can do to a person to enslave a person who has lost their fear of death. All of that to say, rehearse death. Think about it. Contemplate the fact that you too will die one day. It's gonna happen. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm not trying to depress you. No one knows what really happens after death. And if we again regard it scientifically, objectively, philosophically, then we will see that there's nothing to be afraid of. You cannot experience no experience. Therefore, there's no suffering, no pain after death. It's just either nothingness or, in my opinion, it's a continuation in a different life. Because you are life. You're not this life. You're not this body. You are life. And life continues. Maybe not on Earth, maybe somewhere else. But life is life, and that's what you are, and that's what I am. So, anyways, I'm going to head in because this vehicle is getting extremely hot. But thank you for chatting with me, and don't forget to live well and to rehearse death.